Howdy, ESSM 406. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about command and control environmental policy. What do we mean by command and control environmental policy? Most of the classic environmental laws that you think about the United States having, so things like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, which I know many students are writing about, are considered to be basically command and control forms of regulation. Command and control means the government tells you what to do, and it tells you very specifically. So a good example of a command and control regulation would be some facilities are producing air pollution, and the government says facilities, say coal-fired electrical power plants. All coal-fired power plants need to install scrubbers to remove sulfur dioxide from their smokestacks, right? Everyone has to do the same thing. Doesn't matter how much it costs. We don't care how much it costs. If you're in this business, you must behave this way. And we have tons and tons and tons of regulations like this. This is fundamental. It's not just an environmental policy. A lot of health and safety regulations are also command and control regulations. If you think about it in a way a lot of taxes are, you have to pay income tax, you must pay sales tax, businesses must collect a sales tax in states where sales tax exists. So this is basically how government normally works, we can say. And I just want to go over a few really important command and control laws in the United States. Probably the most important environmental law in the United States is called the National Environmental Policy Act. The National Environmental Policy Act, like most of our environmental laws, was signed into law by President Richard Nixon and in 1969. Most of our environmental laws, most of our really important environmental laws were passed in a period between about 1968 and 1974. That's when Richard Nixon was in power, so he signed into law most of our really landmark laws. The National Environmental Policy Act is actually a law that only applies to actions of the federal government. It says that the federal government has to disclose to the public any environmental effects of any action it takes. It does not say it can't damage the environment. It's actually, in that sense, a very weak law. It just says the government must disclose. And the way it does this is it prepares an environmental impact statement. So many of you have probably heard about environmental impact statements. Government does this all the time. If you work on forestry, you might be interested to know that the U.S. Forest Service does more NEPA, writes more environmental impact statements than any other government agency. But highway projects always have to do environmental impact statements. And another place, wetlands permitting, they have to write an environmental impact statement if they're going to give a permit to a private individual to fill a wetland under another law, which is the Clean Water Act. So this is a very important law. Now, the National Environmental Policy Act interacts with another law called the Administrative Procedures Act. Administrative Procedures Act is not an environmental law. It's a law from the 1940s, and it says that the government shouldn't do anything that's, quote, arbitrary and capricious. And the courts have to interpret what arbitrary and capricious means. But this is good, right? We want to protect ourselves from a government doing something arbitrary or capricious. So when the government writes an environmental impact statement, it has to disclose to the public whether there's going to be any environmental effects. It doesn't have to not do anything that harms the environment, right? It just has to disclose. But you, as a citizen, can sue the government and say they have not properly disclosed the environmental impacts of the actions that they're going to take. And this lack of disclosure might be arbitrary and capricious. So that gives the National Environmental Policy Act a lot of power. It's an important decision-making tool for the national government. And some states have very similar laws. In particular, actually, California has a law called the California Environmental Quality Act, which is almost identical to NEPA. Texas does not really have a law like NEPA. So let's talk about another law that's related to this. This is the Endangered Species Act, a law that many of you are writing about in your memos. The Endangered Species Act protects endangered species, right? And it's predominantly a command and control law. Predominantly says you cannot take an endangered species. You cannot damage or kill an endangered species. And if the federal government is going to do anything that might damage a federal endangered species, they have to write an environmental impact statement. So NEPA and the Endangered Species Act are nested together. There are aspects of the Endangered Species Act that are not command and control. So there have been introduced various programs like habitat conservation plans and landowner incentive programs, various other programs working under the Endangered Species Act that are not command and control. But mostly it's a command and control system. The government says that you cannot harm an endangered species. Similarly, Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act say they regulate certain kinds of polluting sources, and they say these things cannot be done. You cannot discharge sewage into the river in the United States. Doesn't matter how much it costs you to stop doing it. Close that pipe going into the river. And the Clean Water Act actually allows citizens to sue the federal government for not protecting us from pollution. So these are some of the classic command and control environmental regulations. Another one that's important to know about relates to water quality. Some of you are interested in water quality issues. And again, under the Clean Water Act, EPA regulates municipal water utilities. And it says water utilities must provide a certain standard of clean water. So that is what command and control is. Now in the next lecture, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of the problems with command and control might be.